I remember the smell of iron before the pain hit me. At 2 a.m., I was lying on the kitchen floor, blood spreading beneath me like a dark river. My breath rattled, but what froze me wasn't the wound. It was my husband standing above me. He didn't reach out. He didn't call for help. He only watched, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes colder than the tiles under my cheek. Then I heard her voice, soft but sharp, slicing the silence. "Leave her. She's already dying." That night, something inside me refused to die. I used to believe my life was the kind that belonged in glossy magazines. A grand house with tall windows, a polished kitchen that smelled of fresh bread, and a husband whose hand always rested lightly on mine when guests came over. I had traded conference rooms and financial forecasts for this, domestic perfection. 34 years old, once a financial strategist respected in my field, I walked away from that world because I thought love was worth more. My friends called me foolish, but I told them happiness wasn't measured in numbers. I was wrong. The house itself was glass and steel, perched on a hill with ocean views, but it never felt like mine. His mother decorated every corner, leaving her mark on walls, rugs, even the silverware. She treated me as though I were a visitor overstaying my welcome. I ignored the comments, telling myself patience was the currency of marriage. When she said, "You're not really family until you give us a son," I laughed it off, hiding the sting behind a polite smile. Yet even in those days, I sensed the fragility beneath the surface. My husband, Mark, had a smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. At dinner, when I asked about his work, he answered in clipped sentences, more absorbed with the buzzing of his phone than my voice. I told myself he was stressed, that it was nothing unusual. But the truth had already begun leaking through the cracks of our glass house. One evening, as I reached for his phone to silence the endless vibration, he snatched it away so fast the knife slipped from my hand. "Don't touch my things," he muttered, his voice colder than the marble counter between us. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. Later that night, when he thought I was asleep, I saw the blue glow of his screen and the curve of a smile he hadn't shown me in months. The following week, his mother cornered me in the hallway. "Do you really think this life suits you? Mark deserves someone who understands him, not a woman who hides behind a wedding band." Her words were laced with poison, but I stood frozen, clutching the railing. She never shouted, never raised her hand, but her cruelty was sharper than any blade. I went to bed that night hearing her voice echo, not real family. Then came the text. It was late, the kind of silence where the whole house feels like it's listening. I walked past his office and saw his phone abandoned on the desk, its screen glowing faintly. One message sat open. "She won't last long." My breath hitched. The words pulsed like a heartbeat. Was it about me or someone else? My hands trembled as I backed away, careful not to make a sound. When he returned moments later, I pretended to be half asleep on the couch. His smile was too easy, too practiced. By then, my world was already slipping. Meals turned tasteless. The house felt like a cage built of glass walls, where everyone could see in, but no one would notice I was breaking apart. I thought of my old career, the woman I used to be, commanding boardrooms with data and foresight. That woman would have recognized the numbers didn't add up, but love had made me blind and loyalty had made me weak. The night it happened, the air was heavy with rain. I had gone downstairs for water, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My vision blurred, and a sudden pain ripped through me, sharp and unexpected, as if my body itself had betrayed me. I remember the glass slipping from my hand, shattering across the tiles, and the sickening warmth spreading down my side. I collapsed, the cold floor pressing against my cheek. When I opened my eyes, Mark was there. He stood above me, hands in his pockets, his shadow long against the kitchen wall. His face was unreadable, empty, as if I were not his wife but a stranger bleeding on his floor. I tried to call his name, but only a wet gasp came out. He didn't move, didn't kneel, didn't call for help. He only watched, like a man waiting for a clock to strike. Then, Cutting through the silence came her voice. His mother, standing at the threshold, her tone calm and deliberate. "Leave her. She's already dying." It was in that moment I understood everything. Their silence, their distance, the careful erosion of my life. I was never meant to belong. I was an outsider, a liability to be erased. But as the world dimmed, something inside me refused to surrender. They thought I was finished, that I would fade quietly into the night. They were wrong. I learned quickly that survival meant silence. After that night on the kitchen floor, I moved like a ghost through the glass house, speaking only when spoken to, keeping my eyes down, letting them believe I was fading. Mark grew confident in my quietness, and his mother's smirk grew sharper with every day I shuffled past her without protest. "She's weak," I overheard her say once, her voice dripping with certainty. They thought I was dissolving, but I was listening, storing every word. In the mornings, I made tea with trembling hands, let them see the cup rattle against its saucer. At dinner, I pushed food around my plate, nodding when Mark asked perfunctory questions about my health. The more fragile I appeared, the less they noticed what I was really doing, watching, remembering, and waiting. My weakness was my shield. One afternoon, while clearing the storage room, his mother insisted I tidy before I go. I stumbled across a dusty box wedged behind old curtains. It was filled with objects from another era, cracked photo albums, yellowed receipts, and at the bottom, a small cassette recorder. My fingers hesitated before pressing play, the mechanical click echoing in the silence. Static filled the room, then his voice emerged. Mark's voice, unmistakable, low and deliberate. "It's time to erase her." The words froze me. I pressed rewind, replayed it again, the tape warbling but clear enough to confirm what I already feared. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't indifference. It was intent, erasure. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to keep listening. There were more recordings, fragments of conversations between him and his mother, their voices weaving plans, talking of accounts, transfers, assets moved under her name. Shaking, I dug deeper in the box and found a leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages lined with Mark's handwriting. Columns of numbers, coded entries, and bank names I recognized instantly. Offshore accounts, shell companies, funds siphoned from joint holdings. Every page was another knife. They had been preparing for this for years, hiding money while letting me believe I was part of their family. I closed the book slowly, my fingers pressing hard against its worn leather. For the first time in months, I felt something powerful surge inside me. Not fear, but clarity. They underestimated me. They had forgotten who I was before I put on this wedding ring. I remembered conference rooms with glass walls brighter than this house, the sharp smell of ink on financial reports, the way people once waited for my approval before signing million-dollar deals. I remembered the thrill of building my own company from scratch, a fintech startup that caught the attention of investors across the coast. I had sold it for love. I had believed love was safer than ambition, but ambition had been waiting, patient, coiled inside me like a serpent. That night, while Mark and his mother sat in the living room laughing softly over a glass of wine, I slipped upstairs and opened my laptop. My hands shook, not with fear, but with the weight of what I was about to do. I created a new account under a name that belonged to no one, an alias I had once considered but never used. I began to build. Every number, every figure, every trick I had buried came back like second nature. I set up a shell corporation, then another, tracing lines of digital ink that no one in this house could follow. By morning, I had laid the foundation of something that was mine, something invisible, untouchable. Days passed. While I shuffled weakly through the halls in their eyes, in secret, I constructed a network of accounts, slowly funneling small, unnoticeable amounts into the system I created. I scoured the notebook I had found, mirrored their techniques, improved upon them. They had taught me unknowingly how to hide. But unlike them, I was not careless. Each transfer was a silent rebellion, a heartbeat of resistance echoing beneath their roof. When I pressed play on the cassette again, hearing Mark's voice repeat those chilling words, "It's time to erase her," I no longer shook. I let it fuel me. If they wanted to erase me, I would write myself back in ink so permanent it would outlast them all. By the end of the month, the first accounts were already showing growth. My investments, small, calculated risks, were multiplying. I watched numbers climb like a secret flame in the dark, invisible to everyone except me. And for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. The days that followed turned into theater, and I became the actress they never expected. At breakfast, I smiled faintly, asked if Mark wanted more coffee, and listened as his mother recited her endless criticisms. Behind my lowered lashes, I was collecting pieces, receipts left on the counter, careless slips of conversation, whispers behind half-closed doors, every cruel remark, every number that didn't align, every document I found tucked into drawers became a thread in the net I was weaving. They believed I was beaten down, but submission was my camouflage. In their arrogance, they spoke freely around me, as though I had already disappeared. One evening, as I walked past the library, I froze when I heard her voice. His mother, sharp and deliberate, said, "Tomorrow, we'll cut her out legally." The words landed like a blade. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to keep walking, my steps steady. They were preparing to erase me not just emotionally, but on paper, where permanence lived. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing every moment back to the beginning. The wedding, the vows, the pen in my hand when I signed documents I hadn't read carefully enough. At the time, I was blinded by love, intoxicated by the belief that Mark was my future. Now, with the notebook in my possession, the pieces fell into place. Our marriage license, the joint accounts, the property deeds, they had been altered, manipulated. From the start, I had been lured into a game where the rules were written against me. The realization cut deeper than betrayal. It was humiliation. I thought of my parents, proud at my wedding, their faith in my choice. I thought of my colleagues from the life I left behind, who once admired my judgment. If they knew the truth, that I had walked into a carefully built trap, they would pity me. I could not bear that. And yet, in that humiliation, something else sparked, fury. Not the kind that burned wild, but the cold kind, the strategic kind that calculated years into the future. They thought they were the only ones writing the rules. They forgot who I was before I wore their name. The next morning, I began to test my control. A missing document here, a copied file there. I slipped papers into my bag, scanned them late at night, returned them perfectly. My collection grew. Evidence of forged signatures, hidden trusts, backdated transfers. Each one was a nail in the coffin of their empire. But just as I felt power settling back into my bones, a new storm rose. It started with whispers, a neighbor avoiding my eyes, a shopkeeper's uncomfortable smile, then headlines. My name splashed across the news, wife's secret affair with business associate exposed. Photos of me leaving a cafe were plastered on screens, twisted into proof of infidelity. The man in the photo? An old colleague, someone I hadn't seen in years, whose conversation was nothing more than catching up. Mark confronted me with the paper in his hand, his voice a performance of outrage. "How could you?" His mother stood behind him, her face carefully arranged into sorrow, as if she were the victim. I looked at them both and said nothing. They wanted me rattled, defensive. Instead, I let silence sharpen the air. But silence could not stop the tide. The story spread fast. Calls from unknown numbers, messages filled with insults. In the court of public opinion, I was guilty before I could speak, and then came the official notice. I was being summoned. They had filed for divorce, citing my infidelity as grounds, dragging me into court not just as a wife betrayed, but as a traitor. The trap had evolved. No longer was I simply a disposable wife. I was now an enemy they could destroy publicly, stripping me not only of money but of reputation. As I folded the notice and placed it on the desk, my reflection in the window stared back at me. Not the broken woman they thought I was, but the strategist awakening again. If they wanted war, I would give them one, but on my terms. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, a place where lives were rewritten with signatures and gavel strikes. They thought it was their battlefield, a stage they had designed for my downfall. What they didn't know was that I had been playing a longer game, a game that stretched far beyond this courtroom. For months, while pretending to wither, I had been quietly channeling every ounce of knowledge I once buried. The accounts I built, the networks I revived, were not simply to keep me afloat. They were seeds. I had invested those hidden funds into a clean energy startup, a company born from the desperation of climate change, designed to turn tides and capture air. It was a gamble only someone like me could recognize as inevitable. The market had called it risky. I had called it certain. Now, on the eve of its IPO, its value soared into the hundreds of millions. The irony was sharp. While they plotted to strip me of scraps, I had been building an empire they couldn't even fathom. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with my head held high, my posture no longer feigned weakness but quiet authority. Mark glanced at me with practiced disdain, his mother with icy satisfaction. They thought they had already won. But seated in the row behind them, I noticed a face that shifted everything. Mr. Harris, their long-trusted financial advisor. He met my gaze, then gave the slightest nod. My pulse steadied. The man who had managed their wealth for years had crossed over to me. The session began. Their lawyer painted me as a faithless wife, a schemer, a woman unworthy of the name she bore. I listened, hands folded neatly, letting each lie hang in the air. When my turn came, I rose slowly and placed a stack of documents on the table. My voice was steady. "These are not my words," I said. "They are theirs." The judge leaned forward as I pressed play on the old cassette recorder. The room filled with Mark's voice, low and deliberate. "It's time to erase her." Gasps rippled through the gallery. I let the tape play, his mother's voice weaving through his, discussing transfers, hidden trusts, forged signatures. Mark's face drained of color. His mother sat rigid, her lips pressed thin. Then another voice spoke, this time live. Mr. Harris rose from his seat, addressing the court. I was asked to conceal funds, to reroute assets through offshore accounts. I did so under instruction from Mrs. Whitmore and her son, but I can no longer remain silent. The shift was seismic. Their own advisor, the man they trusted with every number, now testified against them. And then came another betrayal, this time against them. Their lawyer, the one who had walked in with them, stepped across the aisle. "Your Honor," he said, "I too have evidence to submit." He laid down folders thick with contracts, signatures, and falsified deeds. I was hired to defend them, but I cannot, in good conscience, represent fraud. For a moment, silence consumed the room. I could feel every eye on me, not as the victim they expected, but as something else entirely. A survivor, a strategist, a woman who had turned their weapons into her own. The judge spoke at last, his gavel striking like thunder. "These are serious crimes. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore, you are hereby remanded into custody pending further investigation." I watched as officers stepped forward, the metallic snap of handcuffs cutting through the stillness. Mark turned toward me, his eyes wide, searching for something, mercy perhaps, or recognition. I offered neither. His mother's composure cracked, her hands trembling as they pulled her away. I did not smile. Victory was not joy. It was silence after a storm, heavy and sharp. As they were led out, I exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting, though not vanishing. The empire they built on lies had crumbled in a single morning, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Power never disappears. It shifts. And now it was in my hands. The trial was over, the gavel had fallen, and the empire of lies collapsed in full view of the public. My name, once dragged through the mud as a traitor, now stood at the center of headlines that screamed victory. Wife outsmarts husband and mother-in-law. Financial queen exposes family fraud. But glory has a way of curdling. The applause was shallow, the admiration laced with unease. Strangers on the street stared not with sympathy, but with suspicion. In cafes, I heard my name spoken in whispers. Too calculated, too cold. She must have planned this all along. The same people who once pitied me now feared me. They looked at me as if I were less a woman wronged and more a woman dangerous. At night, the silence in my home was heavier than ever. The glass house no longer echoed with my mother-in-law's voice, no longer carried Mark's footsteps. Yet the walls still felt like prison bars, transparent and suffocating. And then came the message. A single vibration on my phone at midnight. One sentence, no signature. We're not finished. The words carved themselves into me like a scar. I stared at the screen long after it went dark. Someone out there still held a blade against my throat. In the days that followed, the press shifted its gaze. What began as praise turned into scrutiny. Headlines now questioned the woman who had risen from victim to victor. Did she exploit the market? Clean energy IPO, heroism, or revenge? My investment, the company I nurtured in silence, was no longer seen as visionary. Instead, it was painted as a weapon. She built her fortune on betrayal. That was the narrative they loved most. I tried to ignore it, to let the noise wash past me, but noise can drown even the strongest swimmer. The more they dissected my every move, the more I began to doubt my reflection. In interviews, reporters leaned forward with sly smiles, asking, was this about justice, or was it about power? The line blurred until I could no longer distinguish between the two myself, and still, the anonymous messages kept coming. Justice doesn't absolve you. You'll pay too. Each one arrived without a traceable source, a ghost slipping through wires. Sometimes in the quiet, I thought I could almost hear Mark's voice, or her voice, whispering through the static. The cost of power revealed itself in ways I hadn't anticipated. One morning, I received a call from Emily, the closest friend I still had from my old life. She had stood by me when the world painted me a liar, defended me when others turned away. Now, her voice trembled as she spoke. Lauren, I've been let go. They said the firm can't be associated with controversy. The word struck like a whip. Controversy. Not fraud, not betrayal, not crime. Me. My name had become radioactive, and anyone near it suffered burns. I apologized, though apologies felt like dust. Emily laughed bitterly, not at me, but at the absurdity of it all. You won, Lauren. You won everything, and yet I lost because of it. Her words lingered long after the line went dead. I sat alone, staring at the empire I had built, numbers glowing on screens, accounts swelling with the proof of my survival. But every digit carried weight, the ghosts of those who had been dragged down in my ascent. Victory, I realized, was not pure. It was poisoned, heavy with the bloodless casualties no one else saw. The public had turned me into a myth they could not reconcile, a victim too clever, a wife too strategic, a woman too powerful, and myths are never loved. They are feared, dissected, eventually destroyed. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, I found myself whispering into the empty house. Was this justice? Or was this vengeance dressed as justice? My voice echoed back, hollow, as if the walls themselves demanded an answer. And then the final message came. This time, not just words, but a photograph. It was of me leaving a courthouse, my face angled just enough to look ruthless, my eyes caught in a moment of cold calculation. Across the image, in block letters, every empire falls. I held the phone until my hands shook. Power had saved me, rebuilt me, given me a throne made of iron and glass. But power also demanded tribute, my reputation, my friendships, my peace. And for the first time, I wondered if I had traded one prison for another. The night after the last message, I couldn't sleep. The words, "Every empire falls," burned against my eyelids whenever I closed them. Rain traced lines down the windows, and I sat at the dining table, the same one where I once played the role of obedient wife, staring at the empire I had built on glowing screens. Numbers swelled, assets stretched across continents, proof that I had survived and risen higher than anyone expected. Yet for all the wealth, for all the power, I felt hollow. The ghosts of betrayal haunted every room. I realized then that I had been walking in circles. They had plotted to erase me, and in resisting them, I had become a mirror of their hunger, calculating, ruthless, willing to wound others in pursuit of survival. I was alive, but I was not free. Freedom would mean breaking the cycle, stepping outside the loop of betrayal and vengeance that had defined every day since the night I bled on the kitchen floor. Morning came, soft and gray. I sat with a single cup of coffee and asked myself the question I had avoided. What do you want, Lauren? Not revenge, not proof, not power. I wanted meaning. I wanted what had been denied me in that house, a sense that my existence mattered beyond someone else's scheme. The answer came slowly, like dawn. I remembered every woman I had seen in court, sitting small and frightened, their voices drowned out by louder men. I remembered the letters I had received after my story had first made headlines, messages from strangers who whispered their own secrets of betrayal and manipulation. They looked at me not as a villain, not as a hero, but as proof that survival was possible. That was when I decided. My empire would no longer be just for me. I began quietly funding shelters under anonymous donations, creating scholarships for women who had been forced to abandon their careers for marriages that betrayed them. But anonymity wasn't enough. My silence had once been my cage. Now it was time to speak. I reached out to lawyers, activists, and survivors. We met in borrowed offices, in cafes late at night, our voices hushed but burning with urgency. Out of those meetings, something took form, a foundation dedicated to women betrayed by those closest to them. Not just financial support, but legal aid, psychological care, and most importantly, community. We called it the Phoenix Protocol. The name felt right. I had burned, I had risen, and now I would make sure others did not rise alone. The first press conference was terrifying. I stood before cameras, the same ones that had once painted me as a villain. My palms sweated, my throat tightened, but I spoke anyway. I told the truth. Not the curated version, not the sanitized headlines, but the raw story. How I had been deceived, how I had fought back, and how power without purpose was nothing more than another prison. Some looked skeptical, some hungry for another scandal, but others leaned forward with tears in their eyes. For the first time in years, I felt connection, not judgment. The movement grew faster than I expected. Survivors came forward, stories poured in, donations multiplied. Politicians called, not to condemn, but to collaborate. What I had built in secrecy now stood in the open, undeniable. And yet, even in the glow of newfound purpose, darkness lingered. On the night of our first official gala, as I prepared to take the stage, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the same Lauren who once knelt on a kitchen floor, nor the Lauren who orchestrated an empire in the shadows. She was something else, stronger, sharper, but with shadows still carved into her gaze. When the lights dimmed and the announcer called my name, I stepped onto the stage. Applause rose like thunder, warm and unrelenting. The spotlight bathed me in white, erasing the edges of the room. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, not as validation, but as proof that the cycle could be broken. I began to speak, my voice steady, telling the crowd about the Phoenix Protocol, about the women who had risen despite betrayal, about the power of transforming pain into legacy. Faces blurred in the brightness, but I felt their attention, their breath held with mine. And yet, even as the words left my lips, a question coiled inside me like smoke. Was this justice, or was this vengeance dressed in new clothes? Did it matter that I was helping others if part of me still burned with the memory of revenge? I opened my eyes fully, letting the silence after my speech stretch for one heartbeat too long. My gaze swept the audience, caught in the blinding light. They saw a survivor, a leader, a phoenix, but inside I still felt the ashes. Justice or vengeance? I whispered to myself as the applause roared again. Did I ever really choose? And perhaps that was the truth. Perhaps the choice didn't matter. What mattered was that I had turned survival into something larger than myself, something that would outlast me. But as I stepped off the stage, bathed in cheers, the shadows in my eyes reminded me, every phoenix rises, but every fire leaves scars.